Lovely. Dee, thank you so much for being here today to talk about this very interesting topic of does God exist?
Thank
So
you. Yeah, it's great to be here.
brilliant, brilliant, good stuff. So I thought we could start off just by thinking a little bit about what comes to mind for you when you think about God. So do you get a particular image in your mind or any words or ideas? I mean, this is the kind of thing that I think about, hence my background. But yeah, I'd love to sort of hear about your perspective on, what comes to mind for you when you hear the word God.
Well, it's changed with time. I mean, I grew up as I was growing up in my primary school, we had there was a religious element to the assemblies, so we did the Lord's Prayer, and I had perhaps not a particularly dissimilar thinking because that's the way it was presented about what God was. We think of God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Hmm.
Um, in terms of faith, faith wasn't talked about as I grew up because my mum had been brought up as a Catholic, and then various things that happened in her life, and she said absolutely having nothing to do with that anymore. And it
Interesting.
was my, as I call it, my road to Damascus moment in 2001, where having struggled so much as a scientist to kind of want to think there's something bigger, there has to be, not in control, but something, organizing all this stuff and making
Yeah.
the most amazing things happen, but not being able and wanting to be connected to that, but not being able to recognize with the science journey that I'd been on. Um, and then with time I've explored, well, how does God, how do I want that to sit with me so it's kind of comfortable? Um, and and I did come at it very much from a science perspective. But of course, God, something that we feel that is there, humanity has wanted to connect with that since humans could have those kinds of thoughts. And we've seen this in cultures and communities across the world right from the very beginning. Um, and you know, religion or a faith system or some kind of spirituality has grown in all of those cultures with time, and it's been culturally based. So if I was going to want to connect with something bigger, because where I grew up, it's going to be probably going to be Christianity because that's the religion that I've been exposed to. If this had happened to me in another part of the world, it would have been a different religion. So the Middle East might have been Islam. In China, it would have been something different. Again, in Japan, in Africa, in South America, in Australia, all my cultural seatings would have determined how I imagined that bigger picture. So I have that image of God right the way through until I had my faith moment, and since then I've been kind of tweaking it so it sits comfortably. So this might sound a bit left field, but okay, this is how I see God now as a scientist. The Big Bang,
Yeah.
um, something it was something had to be in existence before the Big Bang for the Big Bang to happen,
Mhm.
and it was all the energy in the universe in one tiny little point became so started moving outwards. All this energy was now out there in whatever we call the universe, and that energy became stuff, and stuff became small stuff became bigger stuff, and we ended up with stars and planets and galaxies and all the rest of it. So, and that energy is still there, and it's still making stuff, and stuff is being formed, and suns are dying, and asteroids are crashing into stuff and all that kind of stuff. So the baseline is that pure energy. So that must be what God is, that bigger thing. That's what it must be. And we're all connected to it because we're all made from it.
Yeah, that's
So
that's fascinating actually. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I just picked up on the fact that you used the word it's there as well, which is somewhat, I guess, different to how perhaps many religious people might refer to God. Often we use pronoun he and things like that. But are you saying then, and correct me if I'm wrong, but are you saying that perhaps your conception of God has shifted a little bit from this to maybe a guiding force in the universe?
absolutely, absolutely, yes. And very recently, having kind of switched denominations, because I ended up 2 and a bit years ago marrying a Methodist minister and now becoming part of the Methodist Church.
Mhm.
And I've now been involved in groups where we're looking very much at the language that we use within church, and how that's then seen outside of the church, and how inclusive it is. And calling God he is clearly not inclusive,
Yeah.
or certainly can be perceived that way. So
Yeah.
I think it's been a kind of a natural shift for me, with the science thing, but also with this wanting to be as inclusive as possible. That it's not, it doesn't have a gender. It's
Yes. It's more of a
it
force.
doesn't need to have.
Sure.
And I think that the way that God the Father has evolved again is culturally based,
Yeah.
because of the patriarchal society that, in which it developed. So yeah, it has, we have to take it in context,
Yeah.
but that context is evolving.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting because a lot of people criticize the so-called practice of anthropomorphizing God. In other words, talking about God as if he's a human, because the idea among most people that believe in God is that he or it is infinitely greater than we are. So actually, you're wrong in comparing God to a human, because that's limiting God, in a much bigger way than God deserves to be, if that makes sense. So I actually have no problem believing in God as a kind of guiding force in the universe. I think where people might struggle is when they start to talk about God as being a specific thing, like all loving, all powerful, all knowing. And then they bring in things like the problem of evil, and like, if God is all of these wonderful things, why do bad things happen? But actually, I think if you take more of a stance that there is just something that is kind of guiding and perhaps started everything off, then I find that a little bit easier to believe in. Would you agree, rather than kind of
Mm.
adding all of these extra characteristics onto
Mm,
God?
absolutely. And we're human, attempting to understand something, and scientists know that we don't have the answers to everything yet. We're probably never going to have the answers to everything.
Yeah.
Some things are going to remain unknowable, understandable.
Yeah.
But in order to feel safe and secure, we have to put these layers on there, so that,
Mm,
because we don't know, I don't know, we don't like that, being in a place of not knowing.
for
it's
sure.
it's hard. It's actually very helpful, and I think it's important to be in that place of not knowing, but it's not something that we're comfortable with. So we will always go back to a place where we can be safe, secure, and we can label things and give them
Yeah.
images and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because I see that on both sides, really. I see some religious believers who are very firm in their belief in God, but equally, I see some atheists who are very firm in their disbelief in God. And it's interesting. I want to go back, if it's okay, to the science coming into it as well, because I've seen scientists go one of two ways usually. So you've got some scientists, and I'm thinking of Richard Dawkins perhaps being the most obvious example, someone who's so immersed in the world of science and is himself a scientist and has come to the conclusion that there simply cannot be a God. And then other scientists who say, actually, the more science I do, the more I think there must be a God. So I'm just curious as to what your view is on the relationship between religion and science, because obviously, if you are, for example, a fundamentalist and you believe in the Bible literally, that doesn't seem to be possible to reconcile with scientific views of the universe. So, for example, if you believe in the Genesis creation story exactly as it says in the Bible, how
And
can
there
you
are, of
then...
course, 2.5 creation stories in
Right,
that. There
sure.
isn't just one.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I just was curious about, is it possible, do you think, to believe in those creation stories and also be scientifically minded?
Yes, is the short answer. And I think a lot of it has to do with how you come at interpreting the Bible, that those written down bits,
Mm,
lots of which came, well, all of it came from oral tradition. None of it was written down initially, and then eventually it was. And it was all about trying to make sense of the world that we find ourselves in, and us as humans, without the skills and knowledge to be able necessarily to make sense of it all. So for me, the Bible, those and thinking about the Old Testament and the New Testament, we're looking at a library of all sorts of different genres of book anyway. Some
Yeah.
is history, some is poetry, and so on. So you wouldn't walk into a library and interpret every single book in that library in exactly the same way.
Yes.
So you
Yeah.
need to understand a lot more about the context in which that writing came to be. And we use allegory and metaphor in our everyday lives all the time to make sense of the world. So that's exactly, I believe, what was happening then, that in order to make sense of what was going on and to then make it accessible to others,
Yes.
to help them make sense of it, to feel secure in what's going on, they come up with these creation stories. And every single faith system has a creation story, this deep innate need to make sense of it, but to do it in a way that is understandable, which means that we're going to have to make it simple
Yes,
and
for sure.
shorten it. You're not,
Yeah.
it's um it I don't believe that God created the world in 6 days.
Yeah.
Um, but if you look at the sequence, it makes scientific sense,
Right.
which I think is incredible. But that when that creation story was written, they actually kind of got the order kind of right in terms of evolution, which is in itself amazing.
Yeah.
But I mean, the other stories in the Bible, and again, my belief is Adam and Eve is allegorical. It's a way of explaining how humanity came to be and various and the way that we see the world. I don't believe that Jonah was swallowed by a fish. That's allegorical. That they're trying to get some kind of message across. And in the New Testament, the Gospels, I
Mm.
don't believe were, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yeah.
Um, and like good journalists, the followers of Jesus in that time needed to get a message across to a particular group of people. So a good journalist is going to write that in a way that's going to make sense to that group of people.
Interesting. I like that way of looking at it from a kind of journalistic point of view. I'm glad that you brought up the Gospels actually, because and this idea of allegory, because it reminds me of something that I read recently, which I'd love to hear your opinion on. It turns out that I think 15% of Christians don't believe that Jesus actually came back from the dead, which I found fascinating personally, because, the way that I've kind of understood it is that actually that belief is fundamental to the Christian faith, because if you don't believe that, then it's very hard to then make the argument that Jesus is in fact the Son of God, that he can in fact conquer death. So yeah, I'd just love to hear your opinion on that. And we talked a little bit before the podcast about how different Christians would have different ideas about things, but could still be labeled Christian. So I'd just be curious to hear your opinion. Is that something also that we could look at as allegorical, this rising from the dead, in the same way that we might do the Genesis story, or is it something that you think Christians should take literally?
That's very interesting way of looking at it. And is it was it resuscitation?
Yeah. Or resurrection. Yeah.
Yes. Now,
Mm.
if you the accounts of the encounters with the risen Jesus, in the way that they've been examined historically, um, unless there was mass hallucinations going on and mass
Yeah.
hysteria going on, then I think those encounters did happen.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't believe that Jesus was resuscitated. So in some way, he came back in some form that was visible to those people, because he did it to a single person, but he also did it to groups of people.
Yeah.
So if you agree that those accounts must be true, a true reflection of what happened, then for me, yes, that did happen.
Mm.
Um, and it's I as a Christian have to have that belief for anything else to make much sense at all.
That's fair enough. Yeah. And again, I've found it quite fascinating because I've always seen it as integral, but clearly it's not, because people do label themselves as Christians and yet 15% don't believe in it literally. And I guess it points to a mystery, doesn't it? Which is, how
And that's
precisely.
what it's and that's what it's all about. And mystery
Yeah,
is good.
for
And
sure.
it goes along this theme of not knowing. This
Yes.
mystery is really important.
Yeah. But people can be uncomfortable with it, right?
Of
So,
course, we don't like not knowing. We when we read a novel, a mystery novel, we want to know why. When we watch a magician doing sleight of hand, we want to know
how
how they
they
do it.
did
We
it. Yeah.
enjoy the mystery, but we would really love to know how they do it.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
weird kind of tension, isn't it? Because on the one hand, it's
Absolutely.
really exciting, but on the other hand, it's frustrating because people really want that certainty. And I think with questions like this, hence why I'm doing this podcast, really, it's really hard to get that, and yet it's so interesting, I think, to discuss. I want to go back to something you've mentioned a couple of times, if that's okay. This idea of that desire that we might have to make sense of the world around us, and that's something that I think some, as it were, critics of religious belief have brought up, where they've said actually. And Freud is a good example of this, actually. Belief in God is just wishful thinking. We're just there. We're looking for this kind of, again, father figure. We're looking for somebody to, turn to in times of distress and uncertainty and difficulty, and just say, there's someone there looking out for me. And again, I don't think personally there's anything wrong with that, especially if it helps you. And there are studies to show that, religious belief can be enormously helpful in a practical way for navigating difficulties in life. But I'd just be curious to hear your opinion on that as a kind of counter argument to religious belief, that actually especially coming at it from a scientific point of view, like just because you want to believe in it doesn't make it true. So yeah, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, interesting. And I think it might tie in a little bit with this idea of us having a conscience, of a knowing what's right and wrong. And from the scientific research into this, and there's heaps and heaps of it, that it would appear that all humans, have this innate sense of when they've done when something is right, and when some actually you shouldn't do that, say that, that's goes
Yeah,
counter to what is right, not necessarily what is acceptable, but what is right. So why do we all have that?
yeah, where
Well,
does that
where's
voice
that
come from?
where does that come from? And
Mm,
is that then linked into this idea of there being something bigger as well, this connection, as I said at the beginning, about this idea of if we've all come from this same initial energy, then that connection isn't ever going to go away. It might be expressed in different ways. And it may well be that because of our physiology, the chemistry in our brains, that that breaks down, which is why there are people who can disregard what they know to be right and wrong, because what they actually believe what they're doing is right.
yeah.
So I think this idea of having a conscience is kind of related to that as well. And I can't really explain it any more than that. It's very hard to kind of verbalize.
It is for sure. And again, I think the conscience is something that's been interpreted in a variety of different ways. There are some kind of certainly medieval religious scholars who would say that the conscience is the voice of God. It's the voice of God kind of telling you what to do or what not to do, depending on the situation. Other psychologists perhaps might take the angle that actually what you're doing is you're internalizing voices of authority that you've heard growing up. I mean, one of the famous kind of points that's raised with respect to this is when you're growing up, the word that you hear by far more than any other is the word no. Don't do that, because you've got parents, teachers, authority figures trying to keep you safe, and the conscience is a way of kind of manifesting that. But again, I think these are just ideas, aren't they? And everybody's going to have
Mm,
a different spin
mm.
on it. So it's really, really difficult. I really want to pick up on something you just said, actually, which I find fascinating. And it might be a way of actually bridging the gap between the different religions. But this idea, and you mentioned it at the beginning as well, that we all come from the same, as it were, source, and we're all connected in that respect, because a lot of other religions say that, that's actually quite an Eastern perspective, this idea that we're all one, and this the separate lives that we're living are just an illusion. Actually, we all come from the same source. I mean, for example, Buddhists believe this. They believe that, we all kind of go back to where we were at the beginning, this idea of oneness, after we die and all of that. So perhaps that perspective actually makes sense when you think about it from a scientific view, when you look at the
Mhm.
origins of the universe. And I just think it's weird when you kind of look at that and you think, well, actually the dots are kind of connecting in a way. So yeah, actually we've mentioned a few things. So, you know, how the universe began, the conscience, this idea of oneness as well. I was just curious about, again, you can think about it from a scientific perspective if you want to, or from a Christian perspective, or both. Is there anything that you think is like a really compelling argument for God's existence? Like you just think, do you know what? Like that's the thing that, you know, makes it really, really clear that there must be a God.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's because if you look at the forces that exist in the universe and determine how things operate, the margins within which those forces need to operate that are so tiny that they only have to be very slightly different, and the
Mm-hmm.
universe that we exist in would not exist at all.
Right. Okay.
It
The
couldn't, it
fine-tuning
couldn't,
argument.
yes, that for me is the absolute, yeah, without that does it for me.
Yeah, well, it's interesting actually, because I mentioned earlier Richard Dawkins, who you could say is the ultimate skeptic when it comes to religious belief, and in some ways is actually kind of, I wouldn't say like anti-religious belief per se, but anti, you know, beliefs that don't necessarily have any scientific foundation. And he was asked the question, are there any good arguments for God's existence? And he said no, but he did concede that that's probably the one that if he had to choose one, you know, under duress, that would probably be the one that he'd point to. This idea that if you change any of the constants, and you'll know more about this than me because I don't have a scientific background, but I know a little bit about it. The idea that our planet is in the so-called Goldilocks zone, where, you know, if we were any closer to the sun, we'd be too hot. If we were any further away, we'd be too cold. Life wouldn't exist as we know it. And it only takes, like you say, those tiny, tiny, tiny changes to actually have a completely different world. And it's for those wondering, it's a variation of the design argument, the idea that actually you look around and things kind of seem to work harmoniously, but add to that the fine-tuning aspect, the idea that if you changed it even ever so slightly, life as we know it wouldn't exist. I agree. I think it's pretty compelling. So cool. Okay, well, we're coming towards the end. Let's think about if there's another last question that I can think about. I mean, is there anything you want to add as a kind of final point on this topic?
Something did pop into my head, and being of that age, it wandered off again.
Happens to me all
Oh,
the time, don't worry.
um, yes, in terms of reconciling religion and science, what's helped quite a bit for me is discovering an organization called Christians in Science.
Okay, great.
Um, and so I'm reading and hearing from a lot of people who are scientists. There's a blog that I've just started following, and I think she's an astrophysicist, and she's written some quite interesting things about this sometimes
Mm,
tension between science and religion.
yeah.
Um, and there's a number of ordained people that I've connected with who
Hmm.
are also scientists. And
Right,
in
okay.
fact, the road to Damascus moment that I referred to
Mm,
was kind of there were a number of things that happened, but the final thing that happened was um, discovering at work, because somebody had left it on my desk because it had been sent in, and they thought, oh, Dee will want to have a look at that, was a book entitled Divine Weather, written by an ex-chief forecaster from the Met Office.
oh wow, I'll
And
have to check that out.
for those who don't know, I am a meteorologist. I worked at the Met Office for a while,
Hmm.
um, and his take on explaining the weather in a biblical context and how we might explain some of this stuff was a major part of me being able to make that tension kind of, it's still there sometimes,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
still not easier to live with, but just more
Easier to
secure.
reconcile,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. Well, I'll leave the link to Christians in Science because I don't know loads about that group actually, but I think that would be really useful for people who might be having similar struggles. I think sometimes people have this misconception that, you know, if you're a Christian or a religious believer, then all scientific you know, theories go out the window. And that's not obviously true, definitely in your case and in the case of many others. So I think it is important where we can see the links where we might not have thought about before. I've never heard of this concept of divine weather, apart from maybe in the context of perhaps ancient people thinking, you know, like if in ancient Greece, for example, you know, they might have looked at the stormy sky and think Zeus is having a bad day, or he's having an argument with one of his many wives or something like that. But to put it in a more sort of Christian context, I think would be fascinating. So yeah, I'll have to check that out. Well, thank you so much, Dee. It's been a pleasure to talk about this with you.
I loved it. It's been great fun. Thank you for letting me come and chat with you like this. It's been
Yeah,
great.
absolutely. Well, I think we could talk about this at length, you know, in a lot of
Absolutely,
other
yeah.
different ways. So perhaps we'll do a part 2 at some point or talk about something similar. I think it'd be great to have you back on. If people want to find out more about your tuition services, where should they go?
I do have a Google business page. So if you just Google M cubed, so that's capital M cubed tuition, then that should bring me up. I have a Facebook business page, similar name, not hugely active on there, but it is there if people want to contact me. And I am also on LinkedIn, so people can contact me that way as well.
Brilliant. Well, again, thank you so much, Dee. Hope to have you back on soon and have a wonderful rest of the day.
And you, thank you very much.
Cheers.